Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Am I too loud? Okay. They say it takes a village. I want to thank the village that put together this particular program. And first of all of you who are attending here and came all the way in this terrible heat to find a little bit of air conditioning in a safe place. Many thanks are due to the team of the Center of Jewish History, Yeshiva University, and Beit Hatfutsot for the dedication and diligence that made this program possible, and of course to the prominent members of the panel who will be introduced later on. I want to say a special thank you to Joel Levy, the previous director of the Center for Jewish History, with whom I began this partnership that led us to today's program. We at Beit Hatfutsot are delighted with our partnership with the Center for Jewish History and its members' entities. Actually, it's not the first time that we're working together. A couple of years ago, we had a wonderful exhibition in here with Yeshiva University Museum it was called Light and Shadows, and it was actually on the oldest diaspora known in Jewish life, and that's the Iranian Jewish community, and I think two representatives of the Iranian Jewish community are here. I also want to thank a special human being, Charney, while preserving and expanding her husband's Leon Charney legacy, about which you will hear later on. She is blazing, as she always did and does, her own path, which includes Beit Hatfutsot. The core mission of Beit Hatfutsot, for those who don't know it, is to tell the unique and ongoing story of the Jewish people. With the new Museum of the Jewish People at its heart, Beit Hatfutsot tells the story of Jewish values, history, achievements, culture, folklore, comprehensively through multiple programs, including our website, which will soon be the largest resource center online and will offer free access to all of our assets and those of other entities. We have a variety of platforms, as I said, to tell the story of the Jewish people and to reinforce Jewish identity and connection to the Jewish people. One of them is the Koret International School for Jewish Peoplehood, that creates educational materials for learning centers around the world, including the United States. We have a visual center, a musical center, we have a Leon Charney center, a Jewish genealogy center, and recently we established the Center for Jewish Dialogue. We are a museum, but not only a museum. We are a global cultural center defined by the Knesset law as the National Center of Jewish communities in Israel and abroad. We are celebrating this year our 40th anniversary, along with the 70th anniversary of the State of Israel, which is why the subject of today's program is so apt. Some of you may know Beit Hatfutsot in its former name, the Museum of the Diaspora, a name change that came about as one of the outcomes of a strategic plan and reflects our vision that recognizes the equality of all centers of Jewish life around the world. That vision also salutes the diversity of the Jewish people and appreciates our unity, not necessarily uniformity. Survey after survey of American Jews warns us that the younger generation is disengaged, indifferent to their Jewish identity, the Jewish community, Judaism, Israel, and commitment to Jewish values. Though 94%, according to Pew survey, announce pride in being Jewish, it is often void of content and depth. This evening, you will be part of a content-rich program. We believe that creativity of all kinds is an integral part of Jewish identity, and many of our programs highlight that aspect, including tonight's, that comes under the category of intellectual creativity. Our partnership with institutions that joined for this program is a testimony to that belief. The future, we believe, actually belongs to enterprises such as those represented today that add value through joint activities to Jewish life. I want to take this opportunity, if you have not been to the new Beit Hatfutsot or the renewed Beit Hatfutsot, to visit us, to see the synagogue hall in its new interactive capacity, to see the special exhibition for young people in age and in heart. It's called Heroes and Trailblazers of the Jewish People. It's a sort of a Jewish Hall of Fame, except that it's done in a very humble way and not a boasting way, without hubris. And lately we opened an exhibition called Let There Be Laughter, a major exhibition on Jewish humor around the world. All you have to say is, Shula sent you, or maybe Tzili sent you, and you'll get in. The virtual red carpet will immediately be rolled for you. At the end of the conversation today, we will be treated to a musical performance titled Breath and Hammer, conceived by the one and only David Krakauer and on the clarinet, and Kathleen Tagg on the piano. It is actually a tribute also to Leon Charney that inspired this entire program because of his love for music. Now it is my pleasure to introduce two inspiring people, Professor Nathaniel Laor. Nati, if I may, is a friend of the Charney family and was a collaborator of Leon Charney. He directs the Cohen-Harris Trauma and Disaster Intervention and Resilience Center. He's affiliated academically with Tel Aviv University, where he's a professor of philosophy, psychiatry, and medical education. He has been clinical professor on the faculty of Yale Child Studies Center since 1994, has been publishing over 100 papers and books in the area of psychiatric trauma and resilience, philosophy and psychology of religion, and rational dialogue as well as the psychology of political extremism, themes that are very pertinent in my opinion. He's also a poet. He's publishing poetry touching on the postmodern and fundamentalist culture crisis in Israeli Torah society. He will be followed by Professor David Myers, the president and CEO of the Center for Jewish History, who has been a professor of Jewish history at UCLA for 25 years, holding the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History. He has written and produced many books, including most recently the very short introduction to Jewish history, published by Oxford University Press. Without further ado, I would like to call on you, Professor Laor.
Thank you, Shula. Thank you, Chili. I'm thinking about my friend, the late Leon Charney, and how he would have started such an evening. What characterized Leon was surprise. And I remember visiting with Chili and Leon the Chinese opera house. It was void. Leon stood up on the podium or the stage. He had a tremendous voice, and it was blasting the air. So today we have 43 יום לעומר. כמה? It was yesterday. ל"ג בעומר. It was yesterday. I'm proceeding. What time is it? You want to do it less? we'll do it less. But I want to move forward. which is 4 שבועות ו6 ימים לעומר. And Leon would have taken it, I believe, this way. ריבונו של עולם. Like something like that. I wouldn't continue. Pinchik. He would have gone this way for 5 minutes in a lecture. And people would have enjoyed it. I would have encroached on you if I had continued. But with Leon, he had a sweet voice and a great talent. And he didn't care much whether he was invited for that or not. People were enjoying it. So to give here an academic lecture about Leon just doesn't give the gist of it. His capacity to engage in music, in humor, with human beings, with Jewish history, with Jews and non-Jews alike, in the area of politics, in the area of poetry, in the area of philosophy, Jewish studies, you name it. You can go and read the Wikipedia. Why should I repeat it? I mean, there's a whole list. But one thing is missing. He was the one who met Arafat first as a delegate of one of our ministers. He was responsible for getting Sharansky out of prison as a messenger of Golda Meir. It's not written in Wikipedia. The guy was taking a risk for his people, and you may ask why. Why would a lawyer, Jewish American, who came up and came out of poverty, made some money, one would say, but this wasn't the important part. It is important. It's nice to have more than $1 billion, but that wasn't the issue for him. The issue for him was transcendence. And it was there with people as well as with God. And when it came to people, it has to do with pikuach nefesh. And it had to do with pikuach nefesh, there was nothing that stood in his way. He was backdoor channeling everywhere he could. So anybody who knew Leon personally could have said that Leon is a very proud person, that he insists even on his honor. However, I knew him personally. He was a very modest person. Internally, he was shy and modest. Have you gotten any huge medals? Have you heard about him? He was leading a TV program. He was interviewing people. He wasn't appearing. He wasn't voicing his opinions. He wasn't a senator. He could have been a president. He could have been anything. But he was behind the scenes. He was making things happen for individuals, communities, as well as for countries. And this way, he got involved with wherever there was also Chilul Hashem or anything wrong done in the name of religion. So for him to act against fundamentalism, to be on the side of peace, to promote peace on both sides, and to risk his life for that, and to put his money where his mouth wasn't an issue. Wherever he heard there was a problem, he was there. I had hundreds, thousands of hours of Leon. He was thinking, he was against polarization of the world, Israel and the US, you may say, Orthodox, conservative, and Reform Judaism. the Muslim world and the Jewish world and the Christian world. He wanted integration. He could see beyond by his capacity to integrate and transcend. And his books, one on the Kaddish and the other one on the strife or battle or war of the Talmuds, had all to do with that. Since today we are going to talk about and you're going to talk about the Talmud, I want to say one word about the Kaddish. How did it come about? Leon lost his wife, his mother. This is my Oedipal. It's nothing to do with Chile. Taking the blame. He lost his mother, and he had no doubt in his mind that he's gonna say Kaddish day after day, 3 times a day. But he was wondering. He was a curious person. He was critical. He didn't take authority for what it stood for, and he was questioning everything. So he asked me, he asked others, why do we say this? Who created this? Nobody could answer. I started to approach a few rabbis in Israel. I got to the top. Nobody could answer. They gave me some reference in the Talmud, this and that. Though it wasn't an answer. The truth of the matter is that if you read that book, you find the answer. You find the answer. So shall I tell you, or are you going to read the book? So the answer, you can find it on the back. The answer is that the Rosh in Germany, he was a student of the Maharam Rothenberg, went to Toledo. His son codified it in the Tur. It was Balaturim. From there, within 200 years, it went through the whole of the Jewish people. Went to Palestine, Cairo, then Ramah, and this was it. It ended up in Poland. Anything that ends up in Poland before the war was stable. So we got it. Now, it's a very funny mitzvah, you know. It's one that you can just sell. You can hire somebody to say it for you. As a child, I was always wondering about such a mitzvah, that you can hire somebody to just perform the mitzvah for you. I don't know anything like that. It's fantastic. Fantastic. Can we as a Jewish community hire another Jewish community for us to be Jewish? For example, the one in Israel to hire the American, or the other way around, the Americans to hire the Israelis to be Jewish. Then you define Israeli as Jews, and you got it. And we got to the point of today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Erev Tov, good evening. My name is David Myers. I am the president and CEO of the Center for Jewish History. I'm really delighted to welcome you all here. Professor Laor, thank you for bringing the spirit of Leon Charney to us this evening in such a moving and evocative way. Tzili Charney, thank you for joining us, gracing us with your presence. And Shula Bahat, my very dear friend of 6 months, thank you for carrying through this original plan that was hatched by my predecessor, Joel Levy, who's with us, and allowing us to begin the work of building a meaningful bridge of partnership. You mentioned all of the extraordinary achievements of Beit Hatfutsot over the course of its 40-year existence. The Center for Jewish History is in its 18th year of existence, a symbolically significant year, and it has become, over that period of time, one of, if not the world's largest center of archival sources related to Jewish history, one of the world's great centers of Jewish history. And it seems really fitting that tonight we build that partnership even further between Beit Hatfutsot, which maybe will translate not as the house of dispersions or diaspora, but the house of centers, and the Center for Jewish History. Because from what little I knew about Leon Charney, and it had a lot to do with his involvement in the Israel-Egyptian peace process, he was a bridge builder. This is what he did. He was a bridge builder, oftentimes in unseen ways. So tonight's session is really a testament to that work of bridge building. We're going to take up the relationship between Israel and diaspora, again in that spirit of bridge building. It is a relationship with considerable complexity to it. Many of us ask ourselves today, what is the nature of the relationship between Israel and diaspora? We're going to do what we like to do at the Center for Jewish History, which is to add a measure of historical depth and perspective to that question by looking at the relationship between the Talmuds extending back to late antiquity and seeing what that relationship can tell us about the link between homeland and diaspora. And we'll ask in the course of our conversation how relevant that terminology is, as Shula herself suggested. Now, I have to say that when we began to think about this, and in fact last week when Shula made sure that each of the panelists got a copy of this book, another book of Leon Charney's Battle of the Two Talmuds, I have to confess that I approached it with some measure of trepidation. I knew of Leon Charney's considerable achievements in law and his work as a behind-the-scenes back-channel diplomat, and certainly as a business person, but I didn't know that he was a scholar. And as a professional scholar, one approaches work such as this with some measure of trepidation and suspicion. I was very surprised. I found it actually a very enjoyable, informative, and illuminating read. It really details carefully the rise of the two Talmuds, the emerging tension between them, the historical and cultural context in which that tension unfolded, and offers a very interesting thesis as well, namely that there was a deep guilt that informed Jews in Babylonia as they went about the work of creating their own Talmud, in no small part because they did not fulfill the mitzvah or commandment of settling in the land of Israel. And here's the interesting twist. That deep guilt inspired many forms of rationalization and argumentation that created, in a certain sense, the Talmudic mind. Right? So out of that guilt emerged a kind of intellectual creativity that was manifested in the project of the Babylonian Talmud. That guilt dissipated over time, but nonetheless, that creative energy remained and informed Jewish diaspora life ever since. It's a very ingenious thesis, and one which we will have an opportunity to meditate upon in the course of our discussions. I think at this point, I am now going to call upon our panelists to join me on stage, and I will very briefly introduce them. What we're going to do is begin with a conversation about the Talmuds in context, and then move to a conversation about relations between diaspora and homeland, and then Israel and diaspora by the end. We're going to have a series of short historical sort of glimpses at this relationship offered by my distinguished colleagues, and then however many of us actually make it up on stage, if anyone else wants to join the party, please do. We're going to have a conversation amongst ourselves and then open up to the audience. So I ask my colleagues to join us on stage, and I will introduce them and then join them in just a second. So first, maybe we'll put in order. Maybe you'll go right next to, because I'll sit back. Thank you, Marjorie. First, Marjorie Lehman, who teaches Talmud and Rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and is the author and editor of a number of award-winning books in her field. To her left is Aaron Kohler, who teaches Bible and Near Eastern Studies at Yeshiva University, where he has written a number of books, including the very well-received Esther in Ancient Jewish Thought. Following Aaron, we'll hear from Professor Shaul Magid, who is not sitting directly to the left of Aaron, but two over, who teaches Jewish thought and religious studies at Indiana University, and whom we have had the pleasure of learning with as the NEH Senior Scholar at the Center for Jewish History this year. And to Shaul's right is Alana Newhouse, who is the founder, the creative energy behind and editor of Tablet Magazine. And Acharon Chaviv, our friend Professor Nati Laor from Tel Aviv. So how are we going to begin? We're going to proceed in chronological fashion. I think our two scholars of antiquity will take approximately 10 minutes to work through the entire history of the Talmuds. Shaul has the small task of taking us from late antiquity to the modern era in about 3.5, which is to say 7 minutes. Then I'll make a very brief offer a brief historical explication, and then we'll open up for conversation in which Alana and Nati will join in. So without further ado, I hand things over to, you can sit, maybe
Oh, do you want to sit?
We'll sit, unless you prefer.
So I just want to actually thank Leon Charney for writing a book in which the two Talmuds are somehow related to this larger conversation of Israel-Diaspora Relations, because it means we actually are going back to my favorite texts. And so I really want to thank him for positioning us here and for conceptualizing this as a conversation that remembers these Jews from so long ago who produced such seminal texts. So my task here in 5 minutes is to basically start a process of explaining to you what the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds are. We actually do have two Talmuds. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit of background history. And the point that I want to make here is that I want to start from 70 CE when the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem, and followed by another revolt called the Bar Kokhba revolt. And essentially, with the destruction of the temple, Jews actually don't congregate in Jerusalem. They don't live in Jerusalem. They actually remain in the land of Israel, but because Jerusalem's becoming a predominantly Roman city, they set up their lives in 3 other cities. One is Lydda, one is Sepphoris or Tzipori, and then Tiberia, Tiberias. So even though this Jerusalem Talmud is called the Jerusalem Talmud, you have to sort of think about it as the Talmud of the land of Israel. So even though the Jews were living physically in the land of Israel, the Jews were in actuality, on some level, in exile in the land of Israel following 70. You have to imagine that they are the minority culture, powers in the hands of a Roman government, not a rabbi. They're not sovereign. They're living without a temple, without a central ritual space, and they're subject to the whim of whatever political, religious changes were occurring at the time, including the move from paganism to Christianity, and the ultimate economic and political deterioration of the Rome in the region. So the Jerusalem Talmud is going to essentially be born out of that. But what I want you to think about here is that while they also developed their own internal government and tried to develop their own sense of authority regarding religious or Jewish law, what's going on there in some ways is paralleling what's happening in Babylonia. So the Jews in Babylonia are also living without a temple. They are our exilic community. They're also living among Sasanians, other religious traditions. And on some level, I want you to just conceptualize that these are really parallel movements or parallel tasks to develop Talmudim or Talmuds. But what I want you to think even more about is that both of these communities are committed to the study of Torah and to the interpretation of Torah. And in doing so, they are able to create something that can be done anywhere. But because both communities are committed to the same project, I want you to just conceptualize these two communities not necessarily as fighting over hegemony or fighting over, let's say, one rabbinic dynasty winning out over another, but I want you to think about them as committed to a very similar project, which is Torah study. So that's sort of on one level where I want to begin, but I also want you to also understand that the Mishnah, which is really the first document that's produced by the rabbis, is the same document that's being studied both in the land of Israel as well as in Babylonia. And that Mishnah produces two strains or two communities that are interpreting the same Mishnah at the same time. The community in Eretz Yisrael, for whatever reason, at the end of the Patriarchate, which is in 425, in Eretz Yisrael, for whatever reason, the Jerusalem or activity on the Jerusalem Talmud pretty much ends. But it continues in Babylonia for much longer, for a variety of reasons that are been debated. And so what I want to just point out, I want you to understand also that the Babylonian Talmud, on many levels, I should say it this way. Rabbis are going back and forth from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia all the time. So they're in a shared mission. And in going back and forth, it is true that many Babylonian rabbis will assume that rabbis in Eretz Yisrael do have more authority. But I think that what also happens is that when the Babylonian Talmud is redacted, it's redacted with knowledge of all the material that comes out of Eretz Yisrael. And so in many ways, what we see in the Babylonian Talmud is a lot of the material that is actually coming right out of Eretz Yisrael. So it's not just a Talmud unto itself. So I want to end with just one little piece of Talmud, just to kind of give you a sense of the attitudes within the communities. So if you look at the Babylonian Talmud, which happens to have material from Eretz Yisrael in it, you will find there a strong and deep longing and desire for Eretz Yisrael, to the point where they're making absolute claims that it is better to live in Eretz Yisrael than anywhere else. And they're redacting that right into the Babylonian Talmud. And so right there you see, a person should forever strive to live in the land of Israel, even in a city whose inhabitants are mostly idolaters, and should avoid living outside the land, even in a city whose inhabitants are mostly Jews. But then what we see in response, right there, is in reaction to that, we have Rabbi Zera, who's actually a Babylonian rabbi and moves to Eretz Yisrael. And he was trying to evade Rav Yehuda, who's another Babylonian rabbi, because he really wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael, and Rav Yehuda didn't want him to go. And so Rav Yehuda turns to Rabbi Zera and he says, whoever goes up from Babylonia to the land of Israel transgresses a positive commandment. For it says in Jeremiah, they shall be carried to Babylon, and there they shall be until the day that I remember them, says the Lord. Point being, even though that verse is taken out of context, it's talking not about the people, it's talking about vessels from the temple, but the point being is that there is an attitude in the Babylonian Talmud of trying to protect the decision to remain in Babylonia and attribute it to waiting for God to make a final decision on where it is they should be. So you see struggle, you see tension within the Babylonian texts, within the Yerushalmi, and within the texts of the Jerusalem Talmud as well. So where I want to just end, because I want to turn over to Aaron, I just want to end by saying, each in their own way, the rabbis are trying to work through the same conflict, and that is, what is the role of Eretz Yisrael in their lives? Is it a metaphor? Is it an image? Is it a dream? Is it something messianic? They're each trying to figure out what their relationship is to Eretz Yisrael. And they stand out for us because all the rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud and in the Jerusalem Talmud, all of them are after this same sense of trying to figure out that relationship. They may come out and disagree and come out on different sides, but they're all, that's their goal. That's part of their mission. That's part of their project, is to struggle with that.
Thanks, Marjorie. So I want to add a couple of aspects to this story to bring it down in time and to set the stage for the political question that the Talmuds actually put on the Jewish intellectual, cultural, religious map for the following centuries. So a couple of things. If we go back in time, as Shula mentioned at the beginning, the Iranian Persian Jewish community had been in exile, so to speak, in quotation marks, for the rest of the night, since the destruction of the first temple. And that takes us back to the 6th century BCE, to the time of the Babylonians. And the vast majority of Jews had remained there through Cyrus, through the proclamation that allowed Jews to come back, through the movement of Ezra and Nehemiah, who brought tens of thousands of Jews back. And they had lived there. And we know very little about what they did there. We know nothing about the educational system. We don't know if they spoke Hebrew. We don't know if they read Torah. We have something like the Book of Esther, which pops up, seems to be a product of that community, seems to reflect the ideology of that community in some ways. But then we have essential silence for about 500 years. And then, as Marjorie said, the Mishnah shows up, literally shows up. It's transported from the land of Israel to Babylonia. And something like, boom, we get the Babylonian Talmud, which is not a trivial cultural project. It's then 500 years, 400, 500 years of absolutely astonishing intellectual activity and energy poured into interpreting this Mishnah, reconciling it with other traditions that they had from the biblical texts, from other teachings that they had from the Tanaim, from the earlier rabbis. And it seems inconceivable that there was no foundation on which this was based. In other words, it seems certain, although I can't say any more than this, that for those centuries of silence, this Babylonian Jewish community had clearly had some sort of Jewish education and cultural foundation in existence, although we don't know much about it. We really can't say very much about it at all. If we had more time, we could say the small details here and there, but there's really no story to tell. Despite that, the Babylonian Talmud does claim that the Jewish community in the land of Israel periodically needed their help. So Ezra, for example, is a great Babylonian Jew back in the 5th century who moves from Babylonia to the land of Israel and does all sorts of religious activity in the land of Israel, strengthening the community in Jerusalem. The Talmud says that's because the Jews in the land of Israel had forgotten the Torah. They needed a Babylonian Jew to come and remind them of it. A few centuries later, the Talmud continues, the Jews in the land of Israel again forgot the Torah. Luckily, a man named Hillel back in the 1st century or so CE, comes from the land of Babylonia to the land of Israel and again reinstates the Torah in the land of Israel. And finally, they turn to the 3rd century CE and they name Rabbi Chia as a last foundational figure who had moved from Babylonia to the land of Israel to again reinstate the Torah that had been forgotten by the Jews in the land of Israel. So the picture that the Babylonian community at least paints in their Talmud is that the land of Israel had constantly actually been nourished by the Jews in exile. And as there's those Jews in Babylonia, as much as we can't say very much about their education, from their perspective, they had constantly been the source that had been fusing the Torah back into the Jewish community in Israel, so that when the Mishnah shows up in the reverse direction, that's actually thanks to the Babylonian community itself. Now, of course, in following centuries, Marjorie mentioned that this is all about learning Torah. And in a sense, that's a narrow definition of Jewish culture. In another sense, it was, for many centuries, the central definition of Jewish culture. And so it's not illegitimate to speak of that as sort of a stand-in for Jewish culture. And it is very clear that for the centuries, what we call after the Talmudic period, the Babylonian Talmud was the one that was authoritative. It was the one that was studied. The Talmud of the land of Israel was more or less abandoned with some notable exceptions here or there. And that's to a large degree because the fates of the Jewish communities in Babylonia and the land of Israel couldn't have differed more than they actually did. And this has nothing to do with some sort of spiritual vibrancy or the power of the internal culture, but because the Jewish community in the land of Israel was subject to all sorts of political pressures, and then from various corners that I won't belabor right now, whereas the Jewish community in Babylonia and Mesopotamia more broadly flourished for many, many centuries, down till the 10th and even the 11th century CE. So when we get the Middle Ages dawning in Europe, it's clear that by then, the center of authority, the center of power, and really the intellectual center of the Jewish people had clearly shifted to Babylonia and away from the land of Israel. It's a slow process. It's not something that I mean to give short shrift to all the details of, but it is very clear that this has a lot to do with broader geopolitical forces and less some sort of judgment of Babylonian Jewish community being qualitatively better than the community in the land of Israel. There's perhaps one last thing that I'll mention, and that's that despite the supremacy of the Babylonian Jewish community when it comes to halakha, when it comes to the Talmud, there are two very important legacies of the Talmudic period from the Jewish community in the land of Israel that do in fact spread to Europe and to much of Jewish culture for the last 1,500 years. And those are two phenomena that don't exist in Babylon, and that's midrash and piyut. All of the midrashim that we have, all of the midrashic literature comes from the land of Israel. There are some midrashic types of comments in the Babylonian Talmud, but with the exception of one long passage in Megillah, there is no Babylonian midrash. All of the midrashim are from the land of Israel. The same is true with piyut. Piyut is a cultural phenomenon from the land of Israel. The idea of writing religious poetry, very intricate language, to be used in the synagogue, not as something separate from religious life, that you have religious life and then you also have poetry, but something deeply embedded in the religious life, that's straight out of Byzantine Palestine. And those two aspects of the Jewish culture in the land of Israel, midrash and piyut, are very powerful echoes of the community of the land of Israel, even though the Talmud produced by that community is vastly overshadowed by the Babylonian Talmud. These genres are intensively studied and utilized in the Jewish communities in Europe in the Middle Ages and are flourishing, in fact, today. Maybe we'll come to that in a bit.
Now it is. Thank you, Shula and David, for inviting me and asking me to offer a few words and then be a part of a conversation. In the Jewish imaginary, Bavel and Yerushalayim, or Babylon and Jerusalem, are more than spatial locales, and they're also more than textual traditions. In a way, they serve as kind of nodal points in a complex web of Jewish responses to the realities of the diaspora, where Judaism, as we know it, arguably was born and flourished. So in about 7 or 8 minutes, I want to give a sketch of some of the most interesting motifs, or some of the interesting motifs, sometimes framed as a binary, but always in tension, overlapping from the post-rabbinic period until the advent of Zionism, in order to illustrate the continuous warp and woof between home and homeland, between reality and aspiration, and between present and future. I'll do this by situating Bavel and Yerushalayim refracted through certain Jewish historical figures, many of whom will be familiar to you, whose work represented various aspects of one or the other. These binaries are not meant to be stable, but are really heuristic tools to illustrate that the tension between Bavel and Yerushalayim, between Babylon and Jerusalem, stretches the entire expanse of Jewish history. In fact, it arguably is Jewish history. So I begin with Judah Halevi and Moses Maimonides. Judah Halevi was from the late 11th century, a Jewish poet and philosopher, perhaps mostly known for his line, "I am in the west, but my heart lies in the east." While later legend has it that he was trampled by a Muslim horseman after arriving in the Holy Land in 1141, there's really no historical proof that he even made it to the Holy Land at all, and more likely died in Egypt that same year. But the legend of Halevi fulfilling the desire in his poem has taken on a life of its own and has made him a medieval symbol of the return to Zion that has resonated throughout Jewish history. The trajectory of Halevi's influence in this regard may rest with the Maharal of Prague, the famous 16th century rabbi whose writings on what he called the unnatural state of the diaspora inspired much of what would become religious Zionism. Maharal, too, lived and died in this symbolic Bavel. Maimonides, both a codifier of Jewish law and philosopher, in some way represents the medieval version of Bavel. His laws of kings depict the return to Zion as a messianic aspiration, and his law code set the standard for Jewish diasporic living for generations. Maimonides did actually spend 1 year in the land of Israel as an adolescent, living in the city of Akko, but then returned to Cairo to live out the rest of his days. His philosophy was deeply rooted and influenced by Arabic and Muslim thinking, and he was seen by some as the quintessence of healthy diasporic Judaism, integrating Judaism with its environs. While many lay claim to Maimonides, from mystics to philosophers to Talmudists, for our purposes, one inheritor of such a Bavlian perspective may be Moses Mendelssohn, who I'll mention below. By the way, Maimonides actually, interestingly, it has a grave in Tiberias and also a grave in Cairo. Which grave is his? The next stop is the Zohar, a 13th century mystical work from Spain presented as a 2nd century midrash from the land of Israel. The Zohar contained its own Bavel-Yerushalayim tension, at once engaging in internal polemics against Christianity, its diasporic home, while claiming to be a product of the Holy Land in a pre-Christian era. But even as a fictional Eretz Yisraeli mystical novel, as Gershom Scholem called it, the Zohar's center is not the land or Yerushalayim, but really its protagonist, Shimon Bar Yochai. In the Zohar, the tzaddik, the righteous one, is the paragon where heaven and earth meet. The more empirical and less fantastical turn from Bavel to Yerushalayim comes in the wake of the Spanish expulsion at the end of the 15th century, when Jews truly begin to move eastward. This sets up all kinds of messianic pretensions, from the more arcane and even bizarre false messiahs David Reuveni and Solomon Molcho to the more popular Jewish community in 16th century Safed, where Kabbalists contemplate a messianic metaphysics of repair, and jurists even try to reinstate the law Sanhedrin of ancient Jerusalem. But still, the symbolic Bavel remained the residence for most Jews, and Yerushalayim was still only an aspiration. This changes in two distinct ways in the 17th century, with two very colorful and important figures in this story, Baruch Spinoza and Shabtai Tzvi. Spinoza, both a critic and student of Maimonides and his theological political treatise, engages in a theory of a republic that would foster religious freedom, enabling Jews to be a part of and not marginals to the societies in which they live. A new Bavel of sorts. On the other side of the binary, the mystical Messiah, Shabtai Tzvi, represents a sea change in shifting Jewish attitudes and even Jewish bodies from the symbolic Bavel to the real Jerusalem. The fact that his main disciple, Nathan Benjamin Ashkenazi of Gaza, also known as Nathan of Gaza, was a resident of the Holy Land and pronounced Shabtai Tzvi a Messiah in the Holy Land, sets the stage for what would come a few centuries later. It's not insignificant that the early Zionists were so fascinated by this false heretical Messiah. With the stroke of divine irony, it may be a mystical heretic and false Messiah that may have been the linchpin that made Yerushalayim more than just an aspiration for many Jews. But not quite yet. On the question of Bavel and Yerushalayim, Spinoza produced two distinct branches. The first is taken up by Moses Mendelssohn, whose book, perhaps ironically called Jerusalem, ironically because it's really not about Jerusalem at all, but rather about Jerusalem in an emancipated Europe, a new Bavel that was not discriminatory but welcoming, and a Judaism that was not antagonistic to European society, but symmetrical with it. In the wake of Shabtai Tzvi, Bavel, now perhaps situated in Mendelssohn's beloved Berlin, lives on. Spinoza's second intellectual progeny worth mentioning is a little bit less known. His name is Moses Hess, a friend of Marx, and one of Marx's disciples, whose book Rome and Jerusalem began to set the stage for a nascent Zionist movement. Hess began to envision a real political reality for Jews in their symbolic Yerushalayim, now more tangible, even before Herzl's The Jewish State. And finally, in 1885, Rav Abraham Isaac Kook, who would later become the Grand Master of Religious Zionism and the first chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine, in 1885, Kook was a 20-year-old rabbi in Lithuania, and Theodor Herzl was a 25-year-old journalist in Vienna. The Dreyfus Affair that would change his life and change the trajectory of Bavel v'Yushalayim for many Jews would occur 9 years later in 1894. But across the Atlantic, other things were happening. In Pittsburgh, in 1885, the leaders of the Reform movement convened what would become a famous convocation resulting in what was known as the Pittsburgh Platform. Here, these leaders of American Jewry staked their claim in a new Bavel, a revolutionary one. In this new Bavel, Yerushalayim was no longer even an aspiration. America was home. Bavel, in some sense, became Yerushalayim. Just as Shabtai Tzvi turned Jews back towards Jerusalem, the Pittsburgh Platform turned them back toward Bavel. The Jews were not a nation, but a religious people. America was the new promised land. Messiah was an idea relegated to the dustbin of history. And then the Dreyfus Affair happened in 1894, and Rev Kook immigrated to Palestine in 1904, the same year that Herzl died. Zionism began to take root, albeit accompanied by a great resistance among the impoverished Jewish masses in Europe. Judaism in America continued to thrive, but now began to rethink its American Bavel-Yerushalayim merger while still remaining wed to a healthy Bavel in the diaspora. So here we have these two nodal points. Bavel and Yerushalayim continue their web of intersecting lines in the diagram of the Jewish imagination. Religion and politics, piety and rebellion, poetry and law, the state and the synagogue. Perhaps neither represents the life of the Jews. Perhaps it's only what lies between them where Jews reside, spiritually, materially, and physically. Perhaps it is only there, in the in-between, neither Bavel nor Yerushalayim, where one can find the genius of Judaism. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shaul, for that Hasidic teaching. And thank you to all of our speakers so far. We have received in the last 20 minutes a pretty textured history of the relations between the Talmuds and diaspora and homeland, Bavel v'Yushalayim. Before we open up for conversation, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about that relationship in the modern age. And obviously I can't do justice to that in 3 minutes, but what I do want to do is mention three models of the relationship between Babylon and Jerusalem, homeland and diaspora. The first of which, well, actually all of these emerge out of the most powerful movement in the West, certainly in the 19th century, and then a very powerful movement in the world in the 20th century, which is nationalism. So all of the thinkers I'm going to mention really operate in under the spell of nationalism, beginning with two great early 20th century Jewish cultural creators. The first is the great Jewish historian Shimon Dubnov, and the second is his friend and conversation partner, the great Zionist theorist Echad Ha'am. They were born within 4 years of each other in the Russian Empire, and they had a fascinating relationship with one another. Dubnov was a great historian who also developed the idea that in every era of Jewish history, there was a main center, and that those centers rotated and revolved over time. And Dubnov believed that in his time, in the early 20th century, the main center of world Jewry was where the largest concentration of Jews was to be found, namely in Eastern Europe. And he had a very intense exchange of letters with Echad Ha'am, who had emerged as one of the most important Zionist thinkers, indeed as a critic Herzl's own vision of political Zionism, Echad Ha'am advanced the idea of cultural Zionism, arguing that the center of the Jewish world must and should be the Merkaz Ruchani, the spiritual center of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And so he and Dubnov went back and forth about what the most appropriate center for the Jewish people should be. In Dubnov's case, the demographic center of Eastern Europe, and in Echad Ha'am's case, the cultural and spiritual center of Eretz Israel. I would describe their understanding of the relationship between diaspora and homeland as a competitive relationship. And indeed, the idea of competition is actually an operative principle in Echad Ha'am's thinking. The second model that I'd like to mention emerged some 4 decades later, after the monumental events of the mid-20th century, the destruction the near destruction of European Jewry in the Holocaust, followed by the monumental return of the Jewish people to their homeland and political sovereignty through the creation of the State of Israel. So in 1950, the leader of the State of Israel, its first Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, entered into an agreement with the leader, as it were, of one important slice of American Jewry, namely Jacob Blaustein, the president of the American Jewish Committee. They forged an understanding and issued a memorandum which basically declared and outlined the operating principles between the Jewish community in America and the Jewish community in Israel, the State of Israel. And what was said in this memorandum of understanding was that each group of Jews in these 2 main centers owed its political loyalty to the state in which it was located, and that there should be no confusion of allegiances of political identity. Clearly, for Jacob Blaustein, what was important was to erase the specter of dual loyalty, which had been such a potent claim against Jews in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and extending into the 1950s. I don't have time to go into it, but this is an example of what I would call a parallel relationship. You had these 2 political entities, as it were. The Jewish community of the United States, which owed its allegiance to the American government, and the State of Israel and its Jewish community. So this is not a competing, but a parallel relationship as outlined in this Memorandum of Understanding. But the final model that I want to articulate, and I mentioned it briefly in talking with Nati just very briefly, was that of one of the great underappreciated Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, a man by the name of Shimon Ravidovich, who was born in the Russian Empire in the late 19th century, in 1897, and led a peripatetic existence that took him from his home in Grajewo to Bialystok, to Berlin, to London and Leeds, Chicago, and then he ended up as a member of the founding faculty of Brandeis University. And there he completed what was his magnum opus, a book that, to echo Shaul's discussion, was entitled Bavel v'Yushalayim, Babylon and Jerusalem. In a certain sense, it's the definitive treatise about the relations between the Jewish community in the diaspora and the Jewish community in the homeland. And there, Ravidovich outlined his core principle of shutafut, of partnership. It's interesting to note that as he made his way throughout the Jewish world outside of the land of Israel, he insisted on writing in Hebrew, and he published his 900-page, 2-volume magnum opus in Hebrew in Waltham, Massachusetts, thereby assuring him of a very small readership. But the core principle was partnership. 2 centers of the same great global cultural nation. That was Ravidovich's principle, and that's, I would say, a model of complementarity. That's a complementary model. So we see competitive, parallel, and complementary. And I would say that in many regards, that complementary model is the ideal, but an ideal that very rarely has been achieved over this long history of relations between Israel and diaspora, between Babylon and Jerusalem, and this leads us to the present. Where are we today in this sort of pendulous swing back and forth between these 2 centers? And I'll turn first to Ilana, and ask, where are we today? I guess I'd pose that by saying some would say we've reached a point in which at which this conversation isn't even relevant, so detached have these two communities become from one another. Some say we should altogether do away with the term diaspora. It no longer has meaning, or it connotes a kind of subordinate status for the diaspora that doesn't make sense anymore. And then others say, especially younger generations, we should sort of begin to revive the idea of diaspora and bring back a new diasporism. I'm curious to know how you see this relationship
So
today.
let's just get rid of everyone. The thing that I think that is striking is how divorced I think we've come from the historical context. And from this conversation, I think that the thing that strikes me about the conversation that is happening here is it does feel to me that the conversation that ends up happening on a practical and kind of crude level politically is one where each side would like for the other to lose. And so, or they would like to sit inside of their side having primacy. And it's simply not, it's historically inaccurate. I think it is more than historically inaccurate and politically unhelpful. I also think that it's psychologically toxic for everyone involved. I think the idea that we want to separate ourselves from parts of our history, or imagine that those parts of our history that are not convenient for what we want the world to be right now, makes us less whole. And in fact, when I was thinking about the three models that you set up, the model that I like a model of competition with no winner. I think that's what's been very good. I think conflict with no winner and no loser has actually been what's been generative. And I wish that people would be okay with that.
So that's the history we need to reclaim, is the history of a kind of animating competition.
Correct. I think it's great. I think it's been terrific for Jewish life. I think it's been terrific for Israel and for its history. I also think it's been terrific for host countries that Jews have lived in. It actually hasn't, it's complicated. It's not like I'm trying to say that it's been only good, but I think it's been incredibly, it's been a font of creativity for Jews.
Nati, how does that strike you? Do you feel like we've lost an appreciation for a kind of competitive tension and no longer have a tolerance for that and seek a kind of resolution? And you can please bring your training as a psychiatrist to this question.
Psychiatrist. First, let me tell you, my training as a Jew was at Markaz Rav Kook. And for me, Ledor Vador and Arvut Adadit are two very important principles. And so we are not here to create a new world. We have a history and we have an unknown future. And the critical enrichment between these two communities is very important. I had a teacher who was Hillel Cook. I don't know, any of you know him, the name, yeah, in the audience. Peter Bergson. Is rarely mentioned in histories when you run through the history. But you mentioned his uncle. I knew him personally, was a very good friend. I consider him a teacher in political science. He tried to run here a committee to save the European Jews. And the American leadership, the American Jewish leadership, chastised him. It was Weiss and Goldman. In Israel, we have two streets, Goldman and Weiss. We don't have a street by the name of Cook. So he was able to think about America as a philosophical infrastructure for the Jewish people in Israel. It wasn't accepted. I hope someday American Jewish community will influence Israel in that direction. It would be a very fruitful one to have a liberal nation state in Israel, so that we could have our own independence, really, as a people belonging to a nation. And we do share a common history, peoplehood, and religion in a pluralistic way. It's not accepted by most Israelis, unfortunately. It's not accepted by Americans. And so, for me, the discussion hasn't started yet. I hope it would soon, because time is running out.
Okay, I want to return to this idea of a creative tension and ask our pre-modern expositors tonight, not by age but by subject matter, whether that, to your mind, has been present and a source of sustenance of Jewish culture as you understand it from your own distinct scholarly perspectives. So has there been a creative tension, a destructive tension, an absence of tension between the two Talmuds and the intellectual projects that issued from them? I'm looking quizzically.
I'm the modern one,
happy to say
so.
Not you, yes.
So I think that's actually a fantastic model, but I think it's also clear that there has to be a tension with a shared foundation. So on the shared foundation, you can then struggle over where to take it, who can do it better, and then it can indeed be generative and productive, as you said. I think there is a possibility of such a model, and the Babylonian Talmud might be such an example, but what we see today is very little of that. You need so much shared, I'll say language, but by language I mean, I do mean language in a technical sense, but I also mean some sort of shared language in which to agree of what, at least in some broad sense, Jewish culture may be, that we can then struggle over where to take it. There are some movements, there's some young people, I don't know if this is who you had in mind, in Berlin, who are doing some fantastic things with diaspora thinking. I think it's not an accident that many of them are Israeli expats, so they actually do come with the language, and they have a sense of Talmud, they have a sense of fluency in the texts, entirely irreligious. This is not a question of religious versus non-religious or conservative versus liberal religiously, but they're able to do something interesting because they're starting from a place of, we're familiar with Jewish culture. We have a sense of ownership over Jewish culture, and now we have a sense of where we want to take Jewish culture. And that can be incredibly productive. I find some of their writings to be absolutely inspiring. In a sense, in a sense more inspiring than much of what comes out of Israel, because they're struggling to synthesize in a way that people can avoid in Israel. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. But I do worry, particularly here, that we don't even have that shared foundation on which to struggle. So this seems more aspirational.
Just quickly, yeah. I mean, now you've been a diagnostician, now turn physician. So Hebrew literacy and some measure of fluency in various domains of Jewish culture.
Yeah. So if we can be sort of fictional physicians, like
Physicians
prescribing
of the soul.
prescribing things that don't entirely seem realistic. I mean, you mentioned Haram. That's that vision of what Zionism could be, sort of like producing culture that then goes out and redounds and multiplies, is such an inspiring vision. It's not where we are. I have no idea what kind of political and cultural forces would be necessary to produce that in the diaspora today, but that seems to be what could, in fact, bring us to a place where diaspora and Israeli communities could really be productive off each other, is if we could get people in diaspora to be, as you say, literate in Hebrew, literate in some sort of Jewish culture. It's a broad sweep, and it's a daunting task, but I don't see how to do it without that.
Okay, I'm going to be the kind of buzzkill here, I think. I would say that it's a negative tension, and I think there are four reasons why. I think first of all, somewhere Ben Gurion said that one of one of the greatest challenges to Zionism will be a robust diaspora. Because he understood that the instability of the diaspora is that which keeps Zionism alive and fresh. And this notion of the negation of the diaspora is something that's so built into Zionist thinking and Zionist education that, in a sense, in one way, contemporary America is Ben-Gurion's worst nightmare. The second thing is, I think Ben-Gurion made three miscalculations, understandable miscalculations, and the three miscalculations gave us what I think we have in the present state of Israel. The first miscalculation was that diaspora Jews would come. The second miscalculation was the Arabs would leave. And the third miscalculation was the Haredim would secularize. Those were three calculations that he made in the state. And it was understandable in the 1930s when the diaspora was in such a precarious state that if there was a Jewish state, why wouldn't Jews come? If there's a Jewish state, why would the Arabs stay? And why would the Haredim live in a secular Jewish society? But the truth is, the Arabs didn't leave, the Jews didn't come, and the Haredim didn't secularize. And in some way, the state of Israel is the result of that. And given the fact that all of the procrastinations aside with the 2013 Pew poll, I think Jews have learned successfully to be in America as Jews. The Haredim have learned how to live in America. The assimilated Jews have learned to live in America. Non-Orthodox Jews have learned to live in America. I think that in a certain way, one of the ways that you see that is something that, if you think about it, something that Ben-Gurion could never have imagined, that you would have now in Berlin, in New York, in Los Angeles, Israeli diasporas. Jews who grow up in Israel that choose to live outside of Israel. That's something that was beyond his imagination. So I think that history has given us a situation where for that relationship, for the negative tension to become a positive tension, there has to be a kind of, to my mind, a radical recalibration of what Zionism actually is. And I don't think it could be the Ahad Ha'am model, because the Ahad Ha'am model of Israel as a spiritual center is a hierarchical one. I mean, Ravidovich, the two centers, is probably, it's not something that's taught, but I think the reality is it's something that is. And also we can talk about other diasporas too. It's not only America and Israel. There are other places that Jews live as well. But I think that's where we are.
Can I just say something to that? I just, I have a friend who comes from an incredibly wealthy family, and he decided to abandon his family when he was 17 and to go off and live his own life. And he always talks about himself as a self-made person. And the thing that always struck me was that I always said to him, but you know that you come from a billionaire family. Like, you are going to get those billions one day. So in fact, it's a weird vacuum to have put yourself in. I feel like I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but you're imagining that either Israel or American Jewry could have emerged and been exactly what they are today without the other one for the last 70 years. And I don't know that psychologically I can conceive of that. I'm not saying I know where we go from here, but I think you're putting them in vacuums that they can't, they're counter histories that I don't know are provable.
And highly unlikely counterfactuals, I would say. Not to mention, I'm not sure that I would agree with you about what Ben-Gurion actually did think about each of those three scenarios. Perhaps the only one that he believed would be realized was the second.
The Arabs would leave.
Yeah, I think he understood exactly what Alana is gesturing towards, that a functioning diaspora was actually essential to the success, and he understood full well, which is why he abrogated it a few hours after he signed the Blaustein agreement, that diaspora Jewry wasn't coming. Anyway, I think, Nati, you want to get in there?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on the last point you made. And I want to make it clear that in Israel, I feel we need you terribly. We need you terribly. It's not so important what Ben Gurion thought. It's important what we need now. And we need your influx. We need your input. We need your philosophy of life, your liberalism, your platforms, your richness in knowledge. We really need American Jews to influence our own culture. We have a fundamentalist majority.
Do you mean through Aliyah?
You can come up with your own ideas. You can rotate through. You don't need to make Aliyah. With our laws, you can rotate through and make a big impact.
Okay. Marjorie.
I guess in order for me to relate my comment back to the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, is I think that we're seeing in the Yerushalmi and the Bavli definitely a bridge where we see them learning from one another back and forth. And I think what you're suggesting is that somehow we have something better than Israel has, and therefore there's something better about America. And America, I think, needs to learn much from Israel, and that there needs to be an equivalent back and forth. And it's a problem when
You're right.
we think
I've done it
somehow
myself.
we think we're better.
I've done it myself.
And I know this firsthand from my son, who's on a gap year in Israel this year, where it's 30 Americans and 30 Israelis, and they both feel the same way, that the Americans think they're better than them, and the Israelis think they're better than them, and there's a constant conflict rather than them learning from each other and recognizing what they have to contribute to each other, which they have a lot to contribute to each other.
May I add a comment? I know I'm out of line for 1 second. In 91, we had the missile attack on Tel Aviv, the Iraq war. And I had my chairman at the Child Study Center back me up. He came, he contributed. I learned a lot from American Jews all over the states, how to handle 3,000 evacuees from Tel Aviv. It was a piece of cake. I wouldn't have been able to handle it so well without their help, intellectually and economically and emotionally. I needed somebody outside there to be, how would you say, a rev? I don't know, it's more than a rev. He was involved. He came, visited, and said, and he saw what I was doing, because we are sort of in a socialist country at the time. And I'd done it twice. In September 11, I did reciprocate here. And then he came and said, look, we do have our own children at war at the black ghettos. And he came up with wonderful ideas and implemented them here. We did the same in September 11 in New York. And I remember with Leon Charney, the late Leon Charney, I was sitting in an interview, and I was talking about that, how we could organize as a community in Israel. He said, do you think we could do it here? Do you want us to be socialists? I said, no, you can be communal. At that time, it was sort of a strange idea. But later on, America picked up on that. But unfortunately, Israel became capitalist. So we could learn a lot from each other and keep an eye on each other.
Right. So in light of that tradition of mutuality, or that aspiration of mutuality, in light of the view of most of us that there should be a creative tension that actually calls to mind the history of the relationship between homeland and diaspora, Bavel v'Yushalayim, I want to ask especially the non-Israelis on the panel a question that harks back to Leon Charney's most, I'd say, controversial claim in the book about guilt as sort of a formative presence in the mindset of the Babylonian Talmudist and the diaspora Jew. And I ask this question in light of the halachic and, in some worlds, moral imperative to move to Israel to live a full Jewish life. I'm curious, honestly, feel guilty that you don't live in Israel? Aaron, I'm going to start with you. Try and share with us.
Yeah, okay, so very quickly, my parents moved to Israel the year that I got married, that we got married, which was almost 20 years ago. My brother lives in Israel, my sister lives in Israel. I have 2 aunts and an uncle who live in America left. Everyone else is in Israel. So even if I didn't feel guilt, I would be told to feel guilt on a regular basis. But I'll be honest. I have 2 things to say. One is that I don't have an instinctive feeling that guilt is a bad thing. That's an unpopular thing today in a lot of realms. People think, I shouldn't feel guilty. It's unhealthy to feel guilty. I'm not convinced that that's true. There might be psychological effects of it, but I am convinced that guilt is sometimes actually a really productive thing to be feeling, reminding us of values that we hold seriously, even if we hold them in the breach. And that's an important tension to live with, however we wind up navigating it in our own lives. So I don't have an aversion to feeling guilty. I think if it's uncomfortable, that's exactly the point. For my own view is actually that I'm concerned, because of what we were talking about a few minutes ago, about even American Jewry. Without the foundation of some sort of common language, by which I mean broad culture, I honestly don't have a lot of confidence that the American Jewish community is going to be any sort of center in a Jewish sense. It'll be a force for all sorts of wonderful things in the coming century, let's say, in America. But I'm far from convinced that we actually see 2 centers of Jewish life right now in some sort of meaningful Jewish way. So when I think about moving to Israel in a selfish way, that's essentially because I think that is actually the single center in the coming century for Jewish culture and civilization, and to the extent that I want to be part of that, I'm not sure there's anywhere else to be.
No, I don't feel guilty, and even if I did, I wouldn't think it was a bad thing. I agree with Aaron. I don't think, I personally, I don't have, I don't like this idea of scrubbing negative feeling from our lives. I find it actually a real problem with public discourse right now, that things that feel like they have negative connotations, we're not supposed to feel them. And I don't.
But you don't feel it.
I happen to not feel it. If I did feel it, I would work with it. I mean, it's like, I happen to not. Look, my mother would say that guilt is the gift that she gave me, and it's where all my creativity comes from. But I happen to, I don't know, I have a much more complex view of history and my place in it, and I don't feel guilty. I also don't know that I agree with Aaron's sort of more pessimistic view of American Jewish life.
One thing that you've said in our earlier conversation is you think there's not enough love in the relationship. And what does that look like? Do you feel like diaspora Jews don't have enough love?
I guess
isn't that a measure of guilt in some sense?
I guess I don't know if I would say love. I would say connection, and I would say kindredness. We've talked about this, and you've said in the past, well, when you're upset with someone, you don't go over to them and say, you know how much I love you. I want to talk to you about how mad I am at you. But actually, I kind of think that maybe you do. I mean, if I call my cousin once every 3 years to tell her how much I hate the guy that she's dating, and that's the only thing I ever tell her, after the 3rd or 4th time, she's not going to want to hear from me. If in the between we have a good and loving relationship, she is going to want to hear from me. And just on that point, the only last thing I would say is I don't only want us to support each other. I actually think it's quite good to go over. I want us to fight with each other. I think American Jews should go to Israel and yell at them. I think Israelis, I know that there are Israelis in my stepkid's school who, you shouldn't yell. You just yelled at me.
All right, you know what? Not go to Israel and yell at Israelis. Shh. Okay, you know what? I think we have enough. Yes. We have enough people on the panel, so I think we're going to hand it over to Marjorie.
Yeah. Okay, so this is what I feel guilty about. It's not so much that I'm not living in Israel that I feel guilty about. I feel like, as a Jewish educator, that I'm failing on some level. Because what I witness and what I see is I see children, especially those who go through day school educations, camping, they don't get a nuanced view of what Israel is all about. They're only allowed to say Israel's perfect, Israel's wonderful, everything is whatever, or they get to say, if they grow up in a different whatever, Israel's terrible, they're not humanitarian, they're doing all these horrible things, and you get this binary or this polarization that isn't healthy at all in our youth, which of course is going to amount to something not so great later on. And I think they need to learn. I mean, I don't love everything America does. I criticize it all the time. I'm very proud to be American and I love it here, but I don't see why it is that we can't love Israel and critique Israel, and love America and critique America. We're not teaching how to do that. And that's, to me, what I feel guilty, because I haven't played that role. I haven't played enough of that role, and I think going back to these sources preparing for today, even in Talmudic literature, there's place to be able to start to generate those conversations, and we don't do that effectively. So.
Well, I am an Israeli citizen, so I'm kind of the Bavel Yerushalayim, an American citizen, and served in the Israeli army during the First Intifada, and my son served in the army during the Second Intifada. I lived in Israel for a little over 10 years. For the first 9.5, I never contemplated moving back to the U.S. I actually chose to move back to the U.S., ironically, to become a scholar of Jewish studies. That was the reality. I mean, if that's the profession that you want, then Israel's not the place to live. Because
I came back to the United States to write a dissertation on Zionist history.
Zionist history. Okay, there you go. I don't feel guilty about my decision. I have 2 children that moved back to Israel and lived there for 6 and 7 years, and then subsequently moved back to the U.S. I would say that, I go there once or twice a year for various reasons, as professional reasons, and I often think about, I have a whole life there, friends that I've known for 30 years. I often think about what it would be like for me to live there again, and given the political reality and given my own inclinations, I think it would actually drive me insane. So I don't really feel guilty, I don't know if I agree with Aaron. I think you can live a full Jewish life in Israel in a particular way. I think you can live a full Jewish life in America too.
Right. So this goes back to the famous claim, oft asserted since the 1970s by A.B. Yehoshua, that it's only possible to live a full Jewish life in Israel, and that diaspora existence is, by definition, I turn to our psychiatrist friend, a condition of neurosis, a neurotic condition. Aaron.
Just one quick thing. I think it's obvious that the people sitting on the stage and people who come to a discussion on Israel-Diaspora Relations are not the problem that we're talking about. When we had, Shaul...
Some would say we are actually the problem.
I think we can all agree that Shaul is the problem, yes.
Right. Shaul's moving back and forth, and you're going there for graduate school, and this sort of travel back and forth. This is exactly the kind of relationship that Nati is saying we need. This is great. Your son's there, so this is the mutual enrichment that we aspire to. The problem is that this is not representative of what American Judaism is right now. If American Judaism were constantly traveling back and forth, going to school there, coming back enriched or not enriched, or mad or frustrated or whatever, but traveling back and forth and feeling like, oh, here's why I'm back now, and here's what I'm going to do on my next trip there, then we're in a different place. And I think that's exactly.
But that would have to require Israelis doing the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. All right.
Absolutely.
Yes. So we could go on for a very long time, but we have actually a musical performance of great quality awaiting us. I want to ask a final question. I'm going to begin with you, Nati, which is, in light of the history which we have tried to bring forth to have a more textured understanding of the present, what would you like to see in the future in thinking of Israel-Diaspora Relations? And if you could confine it to one sentence that is not Germanic in form, that would be great.
It'll be a complicated sentence. German sentence. You're right.
No
A
semicolon.
a Talmudic sentence.
I'm an American and Israeli citizen. I had lived here for 9 years. I moved back. My 2 kids are living here. They cannot live in Israel. I cannot be a full Jew in Israel. I cannot be a full Jew in the States. I would like to be able to be a full Jew here and there. It's impossible.
That's the middle space that Shaul was
That's it.
talking about. Yeah, Shaul.
What I would like to see, I would like to see a real recognition of mutuality. I would like to see Israelis really learn about what American Jews and American Judaism is, just as I would like American Jews to learn what Israeli life and what Israeli Judaism really is, not some prepackaged form. And I think it's really the Ravidovich model that David articulated. That would be, for me, the aspiration.
I would like to see more knowledge of our history and real historical knowledge and more emotional bravery. On both parts. I actually don't think there's a problem with yelling at each other. I think it's good. I like when people yell at me. It means they have strong feelings about the topic and about me. And I actually think that the Israelis who I know want that kind of emotional engagement too. So I'd like to see us be more emotionally attached to one another, even if we're not politically or practically attached. I want us to feel the kindredness and the shared history.
I want all that yelling to take place in Hebrew. And for that purpose, I want diaspora Jews to put a massive investment into basic Jewish literacy, starting with the language. And I think in history, that's what kept it going. Jews could meet each other from France and Baghdad, and they could have a shared culture and a shared language. And without that, I don't know even literally what language we yell at in.
I guess I want people to look into their the reasons for why there is so much tension between the diasporic or the American Jewish community and Israel, and to own that difference and to recognize that some of it comes from a sense of entitlement or a sense of I'm better than you, and to sort of explore how we can unpack that, how we can change that. And I think it's just really important that, we recognize we can't have everything we want. We can't have it every way. We're going to have to make sacrifices for whatever position we choose. And I feel that we're raising children, we're educating children who are not necessarily learning that they can have exactly what they want or say their opinion and be yelled back at. So I just feel on some level that's what I'd like to see happen.
Okay, the correct answer to the question is twofold. One, a birthright movement that runs alongside Birthright Israel that brings Israelis to the communities outside of Israel and educates them about what it's like to live as a Jew in communities that do not have a state-sponsored rabbinate dictating to them. And second, a proposal that combines Dubnov and Chadam in the spirit of Ravidovich, a world forum of Jewish culture every 4 years that brings great Jewish cultural creators together, many of whom would be, in an ideal world, fluent in Hebrew, to talk about the similarities and differences in the articulation of Jewish culture the world over. I'm sure you have many more ideas, probably even better than mine, but we are going to conclude our discussion for now. I'd like to thank the panelists for a very stimulating half hour. We will leave the stage and our musical performance will begin.
I want to thank the panel, and I would like to call the David Krakow, our musicians, to come up to the stage. And to all of you, I will say that outside, all of the books that were mentioned here and the film that was mentioned here are ready for you to take home. And next year, we will test you on them.
Hello, everybody. Greetings. My name is David Krakauer, and Kathleen Tagg and I are absolutely thrilled to do a short concert as a tribute to Leon Charney. And we were so honored by Seely and by Shula to be invited to come and play. And I caught a little bit of the discussion. A lot of it went over my head, but many things, I really didn't know much about being Jewish before I was about 30 years old. I had a bar mitzvah, and the day after my bar mitzvah, I pressed the delete button. It was just a thing that happened to me, that was part of my life. I didn't mean for it to happen, but that's the reality. But when I was in my early 30s, I discovered I was a fully formed professional musician, but I discovered Jewish music. And I think that this discovering Jewish music, joining the band The Klezmatics, making records with them, going out on my own, doing my own thing, collaborating with great string quartets, with orchestras, now recently with Kathleen Tagg in our duo. I think this connection with Jewish culture really taught me not just to be a musician, but to become a citizen of the world. And this really, and so thinking about Leon's great work for peace, this tribute really, our duo, Breath and Hammer, is all about making connections between people and between cultures. So we're going to do 3 pieces for you and take you on a little journey about our various cultural connections that we're involved with. Thank you very much. Now, Kathleen has reminded me that I should tell you about the first piece. So that is a piece that came about from a trip that I took in 1989 to the former Soviet Republic, Moldavia. And there I met a great musician, Emil Kroitor, a great master of Moldavian folk music and Jewish music. And we spent a beautiful day together eating delicious biscuits, playing music, and drinking Moldavian wine. It was a fantastic day. And so this is really about that trip, and about now Emil Kroitor lives in Israel, and it was an incredible moment meeting Jewish people there in Moldavia and seeing them, their great need to be free. And so this is about that trip, and it's called Moldavian Voyage.
bows the, oh, hello. Hi, everybody. Should I say that again? So you'll see I use the single string inside a piano, much as you do with a single string bow instrument. And that was the original inspiration. And then bringing it into New York, living near Duke Ellington's home on 106th Street. It's kind of the Eastern Cape, home of Nelson Mandela, and that entire region of rich bow music from South Africa, meeting New York City. And of course, if you've got David playing, there's a lot of riffs and jazz influences as well. And this piece really was about spending the year 2014, which was a big anniversary year for South Africa, 20 years since our first democratic elections, and was really reflecting on that year and thinking about connections at home and thinking about musical ways of putting those reflections into pieces of music. And this was really about connecting with a neighbor down the road who we were not able to be in contact with prior to that time. So this is Berumbau. Many thanks. And this glove is not a magic glove, it's just to protect the copper strings from my finger.
Kathleen Tagg. Thank you. And we're going to finish now with a traditional piece of klezmer music. And I'm going to precede that with an improvised solo that I do, which kind of encapsulates my whole sound world in about 3 or 4 minutes. But, you know, lately I have been thinking a lot about family when I play this piece. And I thought about my great-grandparents who came to the United States at the end of the 19th century and their incredible bravery. You all know about that. And how they came over, they left everything behind, they risked everything. And they came to the United States, and they were immigrants, and they dressed funny, and they spoke funny, quote unquote, and they looked different, but they made a life, a better life for my grandparents' generation, my parents' generation, my generation, and my children's generation. So this is dedicated with love to my great-grandparents.
Thank you all for coming. Don't forget to take your present, complimentary books and CDs and DVD, and also there is a reception outside and a little bit of nash.